All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is James Kilgore. James is a writer, an educator, and social justice activist. He is the author of the new book, Understanding Mass Incarceration, A People's Guide to the Key Civil Rights Struggle of Our Time. You can find him at freedomneverrests.com. James, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so James, let's begin by discussing what inspired you to write this book.
Well, during my 6.5 years in prison from 2002 to 2009, I really saw an endless parade of black, brown, and poor white bodies coming through the prison gates. And I found that when I got their stories, most of these people were doing incredibly long sentences, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, life without parole, double life. I had one friend that was doing 555 years.
Wow.
And the things that they were convicted for just didn't seem to warrant the kinds of punishment that they were receiving. So I began to ask some questions about that. And when I was released from prison in 2009, I was determined to do something about what I later realized was called mass incarceration, to stop this incredible overpopulation of prisons. And so I began working in my own community, trying to stop the efforts to expand a county jail project. And I also began to research and write about mass incarceration. I organized some study groups on Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and began to write other things. And eventually, I came to the idea of writing a book which I hoped would be an accessible kind of overview of mass incarceration that would be both educational and would be a prod for people to take action to deal with the problem of mass incarceration.
What's interesting is that one of the main things in your book is explaining that mass incarceration is more than just the prisons themselves and the war on drugs. Explain how big mass incarceration is and how it's actually a lot more than what people think it actually involves.
Well, I think locking up people is but one part of mass incarceration. It's the most visible and perhaps the most sinister. But I think it reflects a change in attitude about how our nation deals with issues of poverty and inequality. Because marching hand in hand with the expansion of prisons and jails has been the decimation of mental health systems, state mental health hospitals being closed in huge numbers, has been the closure of substance abuse treatment and the cutback in public housing provision. And so a lot of people whose main problem is really a problem of poverty and or a problem of mental health or substance abuse problems are ending up being treated by incarceration rather than through the kinds of public health and welfare approach that existed before. So this is why I think that although we need to reform the criminal justice system, it's not enough simply to let people out of prisons and jails, but we also have to change the mindset about how we address these problems and what policies are put in place to deal with them and how our resources are allocated.
So chapter 1 of the book is essentially a snapshot of mass incarceration. Let's get right now to the basics. Who right now, just by general stats here, who is in prison and why are they in jail right now?
Well, we have roughly 1.3 million people in prisons and another 700,000 to 800,000 people in local county jails. So it's a total of around 2.2 to 2.3 million people who are locked up. We also have close to another 7 million people who are under some kinds of community supervision, usually known as parole, probation, or supervised release. And then we also have millions more family members who have loved ones who are incarcerated who are also greatly affected by this. They're forced to shoulder financial and emotional burdens because of having a person incarcerated. Can be very expensive trying to visit prisons which are far away, paying legal fees, and so forth. Plus, we have the situation of the disproportionate incarceration of people of color. So about 40% of the people who are in prison are African American, even though they make up only about 14% of the general population. Latinos are almost 30%, although they make up roughly the same portion of the general population as African Americans. So this is a disproportionate punishment of people of color, and most of the people who are in prison, regardless of their race, are poorer and less educated than the average person.
Let's dig into the history of mass incarceration. How exactly did we get to this point?
Well, in the early 1980s, I think this is kind of the turning point, Matt. The rise of Ronald Reagan, the Ronald Reagan presidency, and him really kicking it off by advocating what he labeled a war on drugs. And although in the early 1980s, drugs were not even identified in public opinion polls as a key social problem in the U.S., for Reagan, that particular issue had political traction. He used it as a way to attract socially conservative, predominantly white voters who had been in the Democratic ranks. He used criminalization, creating fear of criminals, fear of drug dealers, and so forth, as a way to mobilize people to the ranks of the Republican Party, and built this image of the criminal, and the criminal always seemed to be a young person of color, particularly young black males were stereotyped, as thugs, as gangsters, as drug dealers, and so forth. And that was used as a political tool to mobilize popular support for mass incarceration. But also, it was about shifting the function of the state, moving away from the idea that the state should be a provider of social welfare to the idea that the state should be primarily focusing on helping corporations to increase profit and carrying out its security and policing functions rather than its welfare functions. So I think that ideological shift is the root. And then once we began to build prisons and jails to fight the war on drugs and so forth, a whole host of groups developed a political and a financial interest in expanding the project. From private prison operators to companies that build prisons to companies that supply goods and services to prisons, all of them became financially vested in having this system grow because it was helping expand their profits.
What's interesting, and you make this point in your book, many people do want to blame the current prison industrial complex entirely on Republicans. But as you sort of said even just a moment ago, this is actually a bipartisan problem. This is something that very much the liberal side of things also has a very, very huge stake in the way things are.
That's absolutely true, Matt. In the Clinton era, the prison population expanded even more than during the Reagan era. And also we find that if we look at the votes in Congress around issues that were directed at making harsher sentencing laws, we find tremendous bipartisan approach. One of the bills that Reagan pushed through in the dying days of his administration on harsher drug sentencing passed through the Congress by a vote of 346 to 11. I don't know what you could get the Congress to agree on today with that kind of a majority. It really was a bipartisan approach, and Bill Clinton put in some fairly important legislation which ended up stigmatizing people with felony convictions, denying them access to public housing, to welfare benefits, to food stamps, and so forth, and making it very, very difficult for people coming out of prison to be able to transition to society. He also was responsible for pushing through the denial of Pell Grants to people who were incarcerated, Pell Grants being scholarships for college study for people who are incarcerated. And all studies have shown that gaining higher education within prison is one of the main ways to keep people from returning to being incarcerated once they're released.
Let's discuss how the very philosophy of prison has changed over the recent years? Let's get into that a bit.
Well, previously, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, we had this notion of rehabilitation. And there were extensive programs in prisons and jails to give people training opportunities, to provide them with therapy, to provide them with some kind of support that they would receive once they returned to the streets. Also, parole and probation officers were trained in the vein of social workers, that is, to provide support, to provide counseling, to help people with opportunities once they were released from prison. But the notion of rehabilitation has largely disappeared from prisons and jails, and instead people are warehoused in these places with very little to do and very little sense of developing or creating something that's going to help them in the future. Similarly, parole officers in particular have become much more like police than like social workers. In many states, parole officers carry sidearms. My parole officer, for example, the first time he came through my door was packing a .45 on his hip, and he didn't have many words of advice for me other than telling me the things that I shouldn't do. This has been replicated. We find parole officers often, instead of giving opportunities to their clients, they spend their time cruising around in police cars looking to see if their clients are on the street being involved in illicit activity. And that sort of policing function has expanded with the increase in what we call technical violations, that is, sending people back to prison for simple non-criminal activity like being late for a meeting with a parole officer, failing to report a change of address or a change of employment. All of these technical violations might warrant some kind of rebuke, but certainly not reincarceration.